So today I wanted to get into annotations. I wanted to try to walk through some of the annotation functionality that exists in Semiotic and talk a little bit about cross-highlighting, which has been made quite a bit easier now with the latest version. 1.8.2 is the most recent release as of when I started streaming this. So for those of you who aren't familiar, this Pokemon dashboard was the dashboard that I built in the last couple of sessions. It has a brush over here that allows me to brush this scatter plot of Pokemon that are sorted by height and weight. And then that brush over here also filters and drives these other visualizations of that data set. So we've got a scatter plot. When you hover on it, it has a viz in tooltip of the attack, hit point, defense, etc. of each Pokemon. We have a bar chart, stacked bar chart of the height in meters, organized by the primary type of the Pokemon. We have a radial dendrogram over here that shows the type, and then if it has a subtype, the subtype. So you can see these nested Pokemon over here that have multiple types, and then you see these Pokemon over here that have only a single type. And then we have a little line chart that's showing the height of Pokemon by generation. So you can see that for the most part, as Pokemon evolve or grow up or whatever it's called, for the most part they get taller. And only a couple of them, the Hitmonchan from Hitmonlee, and another notable example, which I think was, we've filtered it out. Nope, that's not it. Some blue one around here. There we go. This Dragonair. I guess not a blue one, a purple dragon colored, which starts out small, gets taller, and then gets shorter, though it continues to get heavier over time. So that's the kind of dashboard that I made so that we could explore Pokemon height and weight. I thought it was an interesting view into Pokemon. And now I want to talk about annotations. So I've mentioned this in other live streams. The hover effect that you have when I hover over here and I get this HTML tooltip, that's an annotation in Semiotic. So Semiotic has an annotation layer. Each data visualization frame has its own annotation layer. That annotation layer has an HTML and an SVG annotation layer. And you can actually not only adjust the content of this tooltip using tooltip content settings in your frame. So if we go look at that real quick, pancakes. If we go look at that real quick, we can go see where that's set. So brushable scatter plot is this mini-map XY frame. And then I say tooltip content, and literally this is not efficient, you should have this pulled out, but literally in line I declare this function that returns a div and some content, some of that content being some more data visualization. And that affects the tooltip content, so the HTML div that's generated when you hover on an item. But you could actually generate your own HTML annotations, HTML-based annotations. If you wanted to, you can write custom SVG and HTML annotation rules, and they will process the annotations that are passed to your annotations array. You'll notice there's no annotations array being sent right now to this chart. But if I did want to, I could send annotations, and annotations are objects. You send an array of objects. They're objects with a type. So in this case, let's say we want to send an XY annotation. It has a label. That label would be, here's a simple annotation. And then importantly, the annotation itself needs to actually have the data. It has to have the data attributes that the data that you're working with in your data visualization has. So I want this to live somewhere in Pokemon chart space. And we'll look over here. My X successor is height m, and my y-accessor is weight underscore kg. So I could say height m equals, and maybe I'll put this at 4, and then weight kg equals 250. And if I save that and my screen refreshes, now I've got a simple annotation on screen, right? That XY annotation. It's very simple. The XY annotation is just to literally put a dot and a little label there. Now, if I wanted to, some other built-in annotations, there's an X annotation, which will just draw a line at that X position. And you'll notice that now it's using React annotation under the hood to do a React threshold annotation. And you'll also notice that it's ignoring the weight, right? If you send an X or a Y annotation, you only have to send it a value for the axis that it's annotating. So here's another simple annotation. So those are threshold annotations that you could easily deploy. Under the hood, like I said, this is using React annotation. So we could adjust dx and dy, which is just the offset for those for the labels. So you could make the label move to different places. Let's see, it's been a while since I played around with this particular thing, but I think the actual position, right, the position of the actual point that's being annotated on the line is not in chart space, right? You could pass it an X, or in the case of an X annotation, you would pass it a Y, and that would determine where your arrowhead is going in chart space. So anyway, so there's some thresholds. The other kind of annotation, XY annotation, is very primitive. If you want something that's a little, just slightly less primitive, then you can actually pass a React annotation. And the React annotation will look a lot like that initial annotation. It'll annotate an individual point, right? But now it's annotating it in this very attractive way because it's using that React annotation framework underneath. And because it's the React annotation framework, it passes any of the settings that you put into this. So you can do things like disable the connector if you want to. This was a question somebody was asking me just a couple of days ago. Disabled, and apparently I can only, we know how this works, right? And then I'll get distracted and never come back. Let's make sure that there's not, that I don't have any kind of syntax error. A lot of interesting rectangle problems. I'm not sure what's going on there, but I'll take a look at that later. But no, I'm not getting some kind of error with my annotation. I thought it was disabled. Maybe it's disable. Oh, it was disable, right. So there you go. You can turn off the connector. You can turn off the different pieces that make up a React annotation. I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds in this. If you want to, you can go over to the React annotation documentation, which is amazing. You can go take a look at it and just realize that all of this stuff is being passed on through. So here's the other cool thing about this, is that you see all these other really fun annotations that aren't just like an arrow going to something. So this one's a, we'll say annotation callout curve. If you want, instead of passing this string React-annotation, if you want, you can import an annotation from React annotation, and you can pass that instead of that string. And so apparently the way that it's doing the curve is kind of weird. Let's try a different one. Let's go with the circle. Call out circle. Maybe that one will look better. Am I still disabling the connector? Is that why it looks so bad? Yes. Let's not disable the connector, because that was the whole reason why you have these things. And you can disable the connector. You can disable the subject, and you can disable the label, right? Because those are the three parts of an annotation. Susie has this really great annotated annotation, right? I'm sorry, note connector subject. So subject would be the circle, connector is the little line, and note's the whole little object over here. Let's save that, go back and take a look at this, and it won't look nearly so bad. There we go. So here, now we're using a callout circle. If we go back to that callout curve, and there's the curve, and you can adjust the curve's control points and things like that. I'll leave a circle because I think that looks nicest. But this is fundamentally all you're doing. All you're doing is passing annotations to this annotations array, and whatever they are will be displayed on screen. And if you're doing sort of dynamic, interactive work, then that's great because the annotation layer is processed much faster and rendered much faster than the data visualization layer. The data visualization layer re-renders when it receives new settings. And that means new data, new accessors, or anything like that, which means, and I haven't done a sufficiently good tutorial of this, but what it means is that your chart, your frame, should never have, like I've got here, inline functions, right? Every time you send this array to this frame, it's a brand new array. Every time I send this accessor to this frame, it's a brand new accessor. Every time I send this function to this frame, it's a brand new function. All of these things that have not changed should somehow live outside of the render function of your React component. And I really do need to do a big, long tutorial on this and write it up and do a live stream, and I will. And as long as those are outside of, as long as those are not changing, as long as I can do a test under the hood, because that's all Semiotic does, is it just tests to say, is this the same array? Is this the same accessor? As long as it does all that and it comes back true, then it doesn't re-render the data visualization, which means it doesn't recalculate the scales. It doesn't recalculate the extents, because once you change any of those things, then there's a lot that can happen that has to be recalculated under the hood. The whole data pipeline has to be rewritten. And it's grown more efficient, and it'll grow more efficient in the future. But there's only so many assumptions I can make. So if all of those come in this sort of unchanging fashion, then the annotation layer is processed in a completely different place. So you could continuously update your annotations, right? And we're going to do that today. We're going to do these cross highlights and things like that. Have a lot of interactivity on the annotation layer, and it'll be super performant, which is really important when you have 20 charts on screen, or you have charts that are made out of really large data sets. So let's get into that. The other place where you see these annotations, these annotation types, is in that hover annotation property. So hover annotation takes a Boolean, true, false, in which case it turns on hover annotation. There it is, right? It's this HTML tooltip box, and then there's a little circle that's being drawn, which you can't see because for the most part you can just see it on this purple one. You can see that there's a little SVG circle that's been drawn. And that's actually called a frame hover annotation. In fact, I hadn't really thought about this, but if I wanted to, I could instantiate a frame hover annotation. And what it will try to do, as I think about this, so if I want to, I could actually take one of these data points. So I'll take data of 0, right? Which is just, I have no idea. It's the first Pokemon on the list, so one of the crappy Pokemon, right? If I take data of 0 and I spread it onto this object, then it'll get all of those properties, right? And this is literally what hover annotation does under the hood. And then I can give it a type of frame hover. And actually, you should be able to see, I didn't test this out, but this should work. Yeah, and there we go. Like, this is not from hovering. See, here's my cursor over here. This is literally, I've taken the first object out of the array of data, and I've just taken all of its properties and added to it an annotation type, and I put it in the annotations array. This is all that hover annotation does under the hood. And so it turns out the first object was this Onyx Pokemon, and now we're seeing the effect of what would happen if I were to hover on them. And you can see that I can still hover on these, right? It's not like there's only one frame hover that's allowed to be in operation at once. And if we wanted to, we could demonstrate that very quickly and easily, and it'll start to get worse very quickly because it'll get very cluttered. But I could put as many of these on here as I wanted to, right? Go find one that's not completely overlapping. There we go. And this is nice because this is how easy it is to trigger some kind of behavior that looks like sort of user behavior from hovering on one item, maybe on a different chart, and then you come over here and you get that hover effect on your chart. I'm going to get rid of that real quick. Go back to where we were. It goes in the other direction too. So hover annotation takes true or false, or you could send it in an array, and that array could consist of objects or functions that return objects, and I'm sure you've already guessed those objects are annotation types. So here we go. I've got an X-type annotation, and now when I go and hover over this, I get an X annotation from my hovering. Now you'll notice it doesn't say anything, right? So you're kind of like, well, how does that work? How does it say something? Well, it doesn't have anything in the labeled property of the annotation. So over here, we wrote up a label. So if I wanted to, I could write a label, label. And you'd see a label when I'm hovering over it. But that's still not very interesting, not very useful. You could base the label, however, and this is why it takes functions that return objects as well. You could base the label off of, I assume it's name. I haven't looked at this data set very closely, but I assume Pokemon have names. There we go. And it's placing the individual, the label. It's not placing the label anywhere near the Pokemon because that's not how these X or Y threshold annotations work. And if I want to, I could do. Let's see how that looks. But anyway, the whole point here is that it's generating this threshold based on hovering over a particular point. And it's an array, so again, as you might have guessed, you can send as many of these things as you want. So I could send a dynamic annotation like that. I could send a frame hover. Because under the hood, what it does is it just takes the item that I'm hovering over, and it takes its properties and appends them to whatever it is that you've either dynamically generated or just defined as an object. Oh, the reason why it's complaining is because I didn't give it a type. So if I do frame hover, now I've got both of these, right? I've got an X threshold annotation or Y threshold annotation, and I've got that original frame hover. Another annotation, so new annotation, is called highlight. And highlight's extremely useful because up until a certain point, the only way that you could make highlighted shapes was in this really manual fashion, which I keep wondering why it took me so long to just go and implement something. And even the double worst part was that once I implemented it, it was super easy. There is one issue, though, that I'm sure you see right now, is that when I hover over this, it makes everything the same color. So what does highlight do? Well, what highlight does is it says anything that matches the ID value of this hovered item is going to be highlighted. We're going to recreate it in the annotation layer with whatever style that you give here. Now, there's no way for it to know what the ID value is, like what's the unique key or what is my match quality, because I haven't defined anything in the frame. And it's called line ID value, accessor. which is a bit of a misnomer. I'll probably rename it in the future to just something more generic like ID accessor. But it started out as a line ID, right? And it started out as a line ID because it was originally when you wanted to put annotations on a line at a certain point. You had to tell it, well, how do I know which line corresponds to which annotation? But this same functionality now gets used for the highlighting. So if I set line ID accessor to name, then it blows up. Why did it blow up? Who knows? I think for some reason this has to take a... I just noticed that this only takes a function, which doesn't make any sense. It shouldn't. And it's still not working. Why is it not working? What's going on here, Pokemon? I was in such a groove too. Highlight, go check our. Still got this weird junk being drawn here. I think this is from the brush. This should have been fixed in the latest version, which is rather odd why it wouldn't be. In fact, I know it's fixed, so I'm not sure if this Pokemon dashboard, if I need to blow away my node modules and start it all over again. Well, heck, let me go and check my examples. I've got a very nice, robust examples on my website, and there's no shame in looking at them. So creating cross-highlighting, which I will post onto the chat. This is the demo that I walked through to explain all of the different things that kind of stuff that I'm doing right now in front of you. Line ID accessor. It's called line ID accessor. It returns d.title, and I could have sworn it was name. Point style d.type d.name. This doesn't make any sense. This should work. Why isn't this working? Here. Let's go find out. Let's go find out what D looks like. D, just to make sure. Return d.name. I'm not going to get too deeply into the weeds on this, of course, because of course if there's a bug, then it just doesn't, that's not what I expected at all. And I guess I have to actually tell it what D is. Super weird. Why is it something super weird always shows up, even though I sat here and put all these things together so well? So let's see what D looks like. D, family, classification, name. Well, I'll go dig into this. I'm not sure why this isn't working the way it should. Let me go see if it works the way that it should. So this is available in XY frame and ordinal frame. I'm going to go jump to one of these other frames and see if it's giving me the same problems everywhere. So let's go over to this type bars, which is this bar chart over here. And again, we can turn on piece, hover, annotation equals true. And now I can hover over these little pieces. It doesn't tell me what the name is because I haven't told it to tell me what the name is. So I can say tooltip content equals div class name equals tooltip content because I have some CSS rules that are already written for that. And really all I want is, just a few paragraphs. I'll take a d.name. Height, d.height, and weight. d.weight. So now my tooltip at least tells me what the name of these silly Pokemon are. What am I doing? D, return, D dot, oh right, it's height underscore M, and it's weight underscore kg. So I can do that. And then I can go hover over these little guys. And if I want to, let's go and humiliate me some more. I can do the same thing I was doing before, which is I set up a frame hover, right? Which is my little, actual little tooltip. And then I do something like a highlight. Oh, and then by default, the highlight is just a black border. And you'll notice what it's doing is it's highlighting everything on this column. Why is it highlighting everything on this column? Because it doesn't know what else to highlight. So in the OR frame world, then we already have a certain kind of ID accessor. That's what the O accessor is. It tells me everything that's in the same category. I can pass it something called a piece ID accessor, which tells me more specifically, well, which, along with that accessor up there, what else do I need to know what I'm looking at. So the individual pieces are sorted into columns, but those individual pieces then could have within those columns separate identifiers. And in the case of this Pokemon data set, these separate identifiers are, they could be name. Name is a unique one, and it should work here. Who knows why it wasn't working in the other one, but there, now it's working. See, this is my highlight. This is what it's supposed to do. I don't know what's going on over here, but I'll figure it out, and I'll make it better. So we can go with style. We can say something like fill, red, fill opacity, 0.75, and stroke, dark red. These are not colors that I would recommend, but they're colors that I can think of off the top of my head. Now we have a little block. But remember when I was saying the piece ID accessor, and you'll remember over here when I was hovering, it showed me all of the scatter plots. So this highlight doesn't have to be a single brick, right? It doesn't have to be a single item. It's just anything that corresponds to this accessor and this accessor matched to this annotation. So if instead of piece ID accessor, I said to them, well, I know that my columns are sorted by the primary type, right? I could have the piece ID accessor correspond to the secondary type. And what would that do? Well, what it does is it highlights all of the pieces that share a type. Now, in some cases, I'm getting this, there's literally no type that's defined. So d dot type to and otherwise unknown. Now your accessors can all be really, that should handle that, can be complicated. And there we go. So now I'm getting any items, I'm highlighting any items that are in the same category, that O accessor value, and the same piece ID accessor value. That's what my highlight is doing right now. So if I wanted to, I could adjust the content of this, of the tooltip. I could write a custom HTML rule that showed that. But my point here is just to show you that that highlighting isn't just it doesn't have to be just an individual piece. It can be multi-pieces when you highlight. So that's throwing it into the hover annotation, right? I make this piece hover annotation array and I throw a bunch of things in there just like I was showing you before. And this piece ID accessor allows you to do things once you have a piece ID accessor in place. We'll go back to d.name. Allows you to do things like send an annotation. We don't want this. So remember, the piece hover annotation, that's what I'm trying to say here. the piece hover annotation, when I send an array to any of these hover annotation properties, remember that array is going to have whatever I hovered over spread to these objects, okay? So if I wanted to just put some annotations on my chart, more traditionally what you think of as annotations, then I would put them in the annotations array. So for instance, I could put a highlight over in the annotations array, and now I have to actually tell it, well, what am I highlighting? And I could say type 1 equals fire, type 2 equals, I have no idea what else there is. This is where I run into problem. Normal? Let's see if, no, I don't think normal is a type 2. Is it a type 2? Fighting. I think fighting and fire. This is where my lack of Pokemon knowledge starts to show itself, isn't it? Right, there we go. And so, annotations, highlight, piece ID accessor. Oh, that's because my piece ID, see, look at this. So I jumped ahead of myself. So if we go over here and we say type 2, then it should only show the ones that have fire as a subtype, which apparently is none of them. Let's try that in a different order. Exigencies of the data set. Maybe there's nothing that has fire and fighting. No, apparently not. Well, what is this? If it's not fighting, is it ground? Is it? Oh, I know what I could do. Instead of just asking myself blankly, I could turn on hover annotation. I could turn on hover annotation over on this network chart, and I could actually just find out what it is. Look at, oh, and it's only showing me the degree. Isn't that great? Tooltip content. So this is, I mean, as you can see, in some cases, and I am happy to hear suggestions, feature requests for making this start out with a better, smarter default. But in some cases, especially once you get to a dendrogram that's created out of a hierarchical data set, it's hard to just dynamically identify what should be the content of a tooltip. So you're often stuck writing your own tooltip content. That said, it does literally only take a minute to write the tooltip content definition. I realize it could, in this case, what is it? It's d.name or d.key. d.name, right? If it's a Pokemon, if you remember from last week, or d.key if it's one of the parent categories. So now we have it, and now we go look at this. Flying, it's flying, everyone, it's flying, and normal. So let's go find the flying and normal Pokemon and annotate them. What on earth? None of these things. Okay. So flying and normal. There we go. There's our flying and normal Pokemon in a bar chart that's sorted by height. That's showing height and sorted by height. So what's cool about these annotations is even with this piece ID accessor, you already saw it, so I've already given it away. If you want to, you can just send one or the other, and it'll highlight all of those. So now we're looking at, what was this again? All of the type 2 flying, right? Suppose, I wonder, I haven't actually done this before, but I wonder if this would take some kind of thresholding. Let's check and see. It's greater than 1. What would that do? I don't know why I'm checking this in front of everyone. Why didn't I check this? I don't even know if this makes sense. Does this make sense? Huh. I mean, it works. I don't know that it makes sense. It's highlighting everything that is in the same height category as this thing, right? Which means to say your piece ID accessor is everything that's over 1 meter in height. And since this has given you a 2-meter thing, then it says everything in this category is highlighted, and vice versa. So, I mean, that's available. I don't know what to do with that. It looks cool. I think that I'll think about how I might make that a little bit more formal and extend it to give you some opportunity to highlight things that I hadn't really thought you could easily highlight. That was actually pretty straightforward. So we have the hover highlighting. We have the highlighting over here. And you could have, as I've said, you could have this ID accessor turn into something very complicated, right? Or you could say something like d.hover question mark, then d.name, otherwise type 2. So in other words, the ID accessor is using type 2 unless it gets an object that says d.hover. And what could we do? How do we make that object that says d.hover? Well, you just add it, right? Because this is just an object that's going to be spread. And so, it didn't work. I have to take a look in there. D.hover, d.name, otherwise d.type. Maybe that's what's going on wrong with the other one. Maybe there's something about sort of some kind of complex test that's going on there. Obviously, I'll take a look. This isn't exactly what I designed it for, so I should probably get a little bit less excitable. So, hover highlighting. Oh, and we're back to the old rule, so that it's not taken into account anything that doesn't have an unknown. So when it has an unknown, it's matching against it. And let's go see if that highlighting works on our little line chart. It should. If it doesn't, then I expect it not to. How about, let me put it that way. I expect it not to, because of course the line chart lives in the same space as the scatter plot. And if the scatter plot's having some kind of weird issue with highlighting, then why would the line chart do it okay? So let's add a hover annotation, type, highlight. In this case, I want to set the style to be stroke equals red. And then I want to go line ID accessor, line ID accessor equals, I don't have any idea what these lines are. These are generations, Pokemon generations. I don't know what this data set looks like. I should probably just find out, right? Pokemon generations. Where is this data even being sent from? Oh, it's being generated all the way up here. Label. Label is a Pokemon family, and then type is the Pokemon type 1. So either of those would be good, label or type. Label should only highlight the top one. In fact, I should be able to just send this. And then type would highlight corresponding types. And so this works. So why are you working, but you're not working over here? That's the big question, which I'll have to look into more closely later when I'm not in front of countless thousands of people watching from home. So again, now I'm highlighting this and showing the line. Now if I happen to not be showing these as lines, if instead it doesn't look like I'm setting line type anywhere, so I'll just set line type, right? Because this could be a stack chart. Line type equals stacked area. And say fill red, and fill opacity to 0.75. And what happens is when I hover over them, then it gets the fill. Now these don't have a fill themselves. It looks terrible because my line style isn't doing a fill on them. So let me do that first so it doesn't look crazy to you, to those of you at home. There we go. This is just a stacked area chart. There's some nasty overlap because the stroke width is too high. But otherwise, when I hover over them, then it's highlighted, right? And that's all the highlight's supposed to do. There's my line ID accessor. I can go and change this to line ID accessor. I can change this to, what did I say, type. And now when I hover over one, it should hover over all of the Pokemon families that have the same type. But it doesn't. Why doesn't it? How very strange. Doesn't it say type up here? Type, label. Label worked fine, type did not. There might be something that I'm doing somewhere around with the data set that's getting rid of that. And I don't want to, like I said before, I don't want to dive too deeply into that because I don't want to get caught up. I've actually tested this and documented it pretty well. So my guess is actually that I have screwed up some kind of setting in the data rather than it actually being some kind of something that I've made a mistake in the actual whatchamacallit, you know, in the code in Semiotic. And of course, if it is some kind of error in the code in Semiotic, then I will dive into it and I'll go and make sure to fix that. But that's some annotations. That's a real sort of intro to annotations that I wanted to get into and show this sort of highlight annotation. If you want, you can go take a look at this example that I shared on the chat and that I'll include in the description for this video. Because this example talks about a few other things. It talks about highlighting and how you can, specifically it gets into the details of how to set the highlight so it can have these sort of dynamic properties. And then it also talks about how you might cross-highlight between two charts and how you can use highlighting to turn on points. So you can do the whole show line points thing. So when you highlight it, it looks a little bit better. And then it also deals with, you know, how highlighting works in OR Frameland. Now, highlighting does not yet work with summary types in OR Frame. It's something that I'm not 100% sure I think makes sense. But I'll probably implement it. So I will share this festooned example here. Let me jump one more. Let me focus on one more kind of, there's a bunch of different annotations. They're actually relatively well documented on the wiki. There's one other kind of annotation that I did want to get into, and that's in this Pokemon hierarchy. You know, when you're annotating a network, it's kind of challenging. Network annotations work a little bit differently from other kinds of annotations. You have an array, of course, and then you have the types of annotations are like a node, and that node has an ID. And so I can say Pikachu, and then I can give it a label, Pikachu. And there's Pikachu over here, off screen, so maybe I can change that to DX 100. Right, and there's Pikachu. And no matter what happens to change this, in fact, here, let me show you. No matter what happens to change this, Pikachu will always be annotated wherever Pikachu goes. The other kind of annotation that you'll find useful in network frame is called an enclose annotation. Close annotation, instead of taking an ID, takes IDs. And go find out who's living. Let's go over. Who do I want to annotate? Say Zubat and Butterfree. Butterfree, Zubat. And this is like like Whole Foods vegan Pokemon flavors. And it will draw a minimum bounding circle around your Pokemon, so you will get Butterfree and Zubat. as long as it finds one or the other of them. I'm trying to get it so that I get just one of them. There we go. So this apparently in this filtering only Butterfree's around, but you see that it's still drawing the circle, and now it's drawing the minimum bounding circle, which is around the node itself. It takes into account actually the size of the nodes to calculate that minimum bounding circle. And that's nice. There's a second version of this, which is just a rectangular enclosure. It's enclose -rect. And it does exactly the same thing, except instead of a minimum bounding circle, it draws just a bounding box around them. So whichever suits your particular network data set. There is no highlight yet in network limit, so that's something that's not available. I have to figure out whether or not I want to expose sort of ego network highlighting, and I think I do, but if I do, then that'll take a little bit longer. So there's some highlighting. There's some annotations. It's the dynamic annotations and how you adjust them in hover annotation. It's also talking about how you pass different defined annotations into the annotations setting of your frame to allow you to do these things where you can declare different, you can annotate different data points on your data visualization, and also in your annotation sort of highlight or otherwise call out different data points. As I always like to say, feel free to get a hold of me on Twitter, or file a feature request or a bug report on GitHub, or reach out to me on the chat while I'm doing this. And I hope that you find the library useful. I hope that if there are issues that you run into, you let me know so that I can dig into them. Yeah, if you have any questions, just let me know. Thanks everybody, and I will see you